Imagine discovering a set of ancient clay tablets, written thousands of years before Moses, that describe a creation story, a garden-like beginning, a catastrophic global flood, and a list of rulers who lived impossibly long lives. These tablets come from the earliest civilization we know, ancient Sumer, and the deeper scholars dig into them, the more they uncover details that sound like they were lifted straight from the opening chapters of Genesis. Even secular historians admit the parallels are striking, unavoidable, and deeply unsettling. These tablets were buried in the sands of Mesopotamia long before Israel existed as a nation. Yet they preserve memories that mirror the biblical account so closely that the question becomes impossible to ignore. How did these ancient people know the same stories? Tonight, we're going to examine those tablets line by line and uncover the evidence that has been quietly sitting in museums for over a century. Evidence that many people have never heard, and some would prefer you never see. And here's the twist. Instead of disproving the Bible, these ancient texts may actually confirm that Genesis is preserving a far older, far more original account of human beginnings. This is not speculation. This is archaeology, philology, and history converging on one undeniable truth. The earliest civilizations remembered the same events Genesis records. The first tablet is the Eridu Genesis, discovered at Nippur and translated by the Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen. It contains a creation story and a flood narrative that scholars date to around 1600 BC, but based on even earlier Sumerian traditions. It describes a righteous man chosen by God, warned of a coming flood, instructed to build a massive boat, and told to preserve life. This is the earliest known flood story in human history, and its structure mirrors Genesis so closely that even skeptical scholars acknowledge the connection. The Eridu Genesis also describes the world before the flood as a time when humans lived under the rule of early kings who lived for extraordinarily long periods. This leads us to the second tablet, the Sumerian King List. Translated by Samuel Noah Kramer and Jacobsen, this list records rulers who reigned for hundreds of years before a great flood swept over the land. Some reigns are exaggerated into the thousands, but scholars agree these numbers are symbolic. What matters is the pattern: long lifespans before the flood, a global flood dividing history, and dramatically shorter lifespans afterward. This is the exact pattern found in Genesis 5 and 11. Adam lives 930 years, Seth 912, Methuselah 969, and then, after the flood, lifespans drop sharply. The King List preserves the same structure. This is not coincidence. This is cultural memory. The third tablet is the Atrahasis Epic, translated by W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard. It contains a creation of humans from clay, a divine warning of a flood, a chosen man instructed to build a boat, animals taken aboard, a catastrophic deluge, and a sacrifice offered afterward. Again, the parallels to Genesis are overwhelming. But here's the key. Genesis is not copying Atrahasis, and Atrahasis is not copying Genesis. Instead, both appear to preserve a much older shared memory, a real event that ancient cultures remembered differently. This is where the mystery deepens. To understand why these tablets matter, we need to step into the world that produced them. Ancient Sumer was not a primitive society. It was the birthplace of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and urban civilization. Cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur were centers of culture long before Egypt built its first pyramid. These people tracked the stars, mapped the heavens, irrigated vast fields, and built monumental temples. They were not guessing about their past, they were recording it. The Sumerians believed kingship descended from heaven. They believed the earliest rulers lived extraordinary lives. They believed a great flood reset human history, and they believed humanity had a divine origin. These beliefs were not fringe ideas, they were the foundation of their civilization, and they matched the broad outline of Genesis with uncanny precision. The geography is equally revealing. The tablets mention cities like Eridu, Shuruppak, and Nippur, cities located in the same region where Genesis places the rivers of Eden. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through this land. The ancient riverbeds of the Pishon and Gihon have been traced by modern satellite imaging. The world of Genesis is the world of Sumer. Archaeologists have uncovered flood layers in multiple Sumerian cities. At Shuruppak, the city named in the flood tablets, excavators found a massive layer of water-laid clay, nearly 5 feet thick, dating to around 2900 BC. This layer sits directly above the remains of the early city and directly below the remains of the rebuilt city. Something catastrophic happened, something that wiped out the entire settlement, something that matches the flood described in the tablets. Other cities show similar layers. Kish, and Lagash all have evidence of sudden, widespread flooding. These layers are not myth, they are dirt, clay, and sediment. They are physical proof that something enormous swept across the land. And here's the part that rarely gets mentioned. The flood layers line up with the timeline of the Sumerian King List. The King List says the flood occurred after the reign of the pre-flood kings. The archaeology shows a flood layer at the same point in the city's history. The tablets and the dirt tell the same story. Now let's turn to the Hebrew text of Genesis. The opening line says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." The Hebrew word for created is bara, a term used exclusively for divine activity. This is not a mythological battle, this is not a cosmic accident, this is intentional creation. Genesis describes the earth as formless and void, with darkness over the deep. The word for deep, tehom, is linguistically related to the Akkadian word Tiamat, the chaotic waters in Mesopotamian creation stories. But Genesis strips away the mythology. In the Enuma Elish, the gods fight the waters. In Genesis, God simply speaks. Genesis presents the older, purer version of the story, one without the mythological layers that accumulated in surrounding cultures. The flood narrative shows the same pattern. Genesis describes a righteous man named Noah, chosen by God, warned of a coming flood, instructed to build an ark, and told to preserve life. The Eridu Genesis describes a righteous man named Ziusudra. The Atrahasis Epic describes a man named Atrahasis. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a man named Utnapishtim. Different names, different languages, same story. The Hebrew text also contains details that match the tablets. Genesis says the ark was sealed with pitch. Atrahasis says the boat was sealed with pitch. Genesis says animals were taken aboard. Atrahasis says animals were taken aboard. Genesis says the floodwaters covered the earth. The tablets say the floodwaters covered the land. These are not random similarities. These are independent traditions preserving the memory of a real event. Here is where the mystery becomes impossible to ignore. If Genesis were simply copying the Sumerian stories, we would expect it to preserve the mythological elements, but it doesn't. Genesis removes the polytheism. It removes the divine conflict. It removes the magical elements. It removes the contradictions. What remains is a streamlined, coherent, theologically elevated account. This is not the behavior of a copy. This is the behavior of a correction. Genesis presents the original version. The tablets preserve the distorted versions. This is why the parallels exist. Not because Genesis borrowed from Sumer, but because Sumer and Genesis both remember the same ancient events. Scholars have debated these parallels for over a century. Some argue that Genesis borrowed from Mesopotamian traditions during the Babylonian exile. Others argue that the Mesopotamian stories borrowed from an older Semitic tradition. But a growing number of scholars recognize a third possibility. Both traditions preserve memories of real events that occurred long before either text was written. This view is supported by archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology. Cultures around the world preserve flood stories. Over 200 flood traditions exist across continents. Many describe a righteous man, a divine warning, a boat, animals, and a global catastrophe. These stories are not identical, but they share a common core. This is exactly what we would expect if a real event occurred in humanity's early history. Before writing existed, stories were preserved orally. Oral cultures are not careless, they are meticulous. They use repetition, rhythm, and structure to preserve stories across generations. The flood story, the creation story, and the genealogies could have been preserved orally for centuries before they were written down. This explains why the Sumerian tablets and Genesis share the same structure. They are drawing from the same ancient memory. The power of oral tradition becomes even more compelling when we consider how ancient cultures preserved their most important memories. In societies without writing, stories were not casual entertainment. They were sacred. They were rehearsed, repeated, and recited with precision. The flood story, the creation story, and the genealogies were not myths to these people. They were the backbone of their identity. They were the explanation for why the world was the way it was. They were the foundation of their worldview. And when writing finally emerged in Sumer, these ancient memories were carved into clay. This is why the earliest written stories in human history are not about kings, wars, or economics. They are about creation, divine beings, and a catastrophic flood. The first thing humanity wrote down was its origin story, and that origin story looks remarkably like Genesis. The discovery of these tablets is a story in itself. In the mid-1800s, European explorers and archaeologists began digging in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. They uncovered thousands of clay tablets, many broken, many fragmentary, but all covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing. At first, no one could read them. The language was lost. The script was forgotten. But slowly, scholars deciphered the symbols. And when they did, they realized they were holding the earliest written records of human civilization. Among these tablets were the flood stories, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis Epic, the Sumerian King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These were not obscure texts. They were central to the culture. They were copied, recopied, and preserved for centuries. They were the stories every Sumerian child grew up hearing, and they matched the broad outline of Genesis. One of the most dramatic discoveries occurred in the 1870s, when a young British scholar named George Smith was working at the British Museum. He was examining a tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh when he realized it contained a flood story. He became so excited that he reportedly jumped up from his desk, ran around the room, and began tearing off his clothes in astonishment. The idea that the Bible's flood story had a parallel in ancient Mesopotamia was shocking at the time. But today we know that the Gilgamesh flood story was itself based on older Sumerian traditions. The flood hero appears in multiple ancient texts. In the Eridu Genesis, he is Ziusudra. In the Atrahasis Epic, he is Atrahasis. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he is Utnapishtim. In Genesis, he is Noah. These names are not identical, but they share a common structure. They represent the same archetype, a righteous man chosen by God to survive a global catastrophe. Ziusudra means life of long days. Atrahasis means exceedingly wise. Utnapishtim means he found life. Noah means rest or comfort. These names reflect the role of the flood hero in each culture. But the core story remains the same. A divine warning, a massive boat, the preservation of life, a catastrophic flood, a sacrifice afterward, a blessing, a new beginning. This pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. It is the fingerprint of a shared memory. The descriptions of the boat in the tablets are remarkably detailed. The Atrahasis Epic describes a massive vessel sealed with pitch, divided into compartments, and loaded with animals. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a boat that is square in shape, with equal length and width, sealed with bitumen, and built according to divine instructions. Genesis describes an ark that is rectangular, sealed with pitch, and built according to precise measurements. These differences are exactly what we would expect from independent traditions. The core elements match, the details vary. This is how oral traditions evolve. But the fact that all three traditions describe a boat sealed with pitch is significant. Pitch was a real material used in ancient Mesopotamia for waterproofing. The Sumerians used it for boats, buildings, and even jewelry. The use of pitch in all three accounts is a detail rooted in real ancient technology. The flood described in the tablets is not a local rainstorm. It is a global catastrophe. The Eridu Genesis says the floodwaters covered the land. The Atrahasis Epic says the storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights, destroying everything. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood as so violent that even the gods were terrified. Genesis describes the fountains of the deep bursting forth and the windows of heaven opening. The language is different, but the event is the same. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive flooding in multiple Mesopotamian cities. The flood layers are real. They are thick, they are widespread, and they date to the same general period. This is not myth. This is history. After the flood, the tablets describe a new beginning. Zeusudra is granted eternal life. Atrahasis offers a sacrifice. Utnapishtim is taken to a distant land. Genesis describes Noah offering a sacrifice, God establishing a covenant, and humanity beginning anew. The details differ, but the structure is the same. A flood, a survivor, a sacrifice, a blessing, a new world. The Sumerian King List also reflects this pattern. It divides history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. The pre-flood kings live extraordinarily long lives. The post-flood kings live shorter lives. This is exactly what we see in Genesis. The genealogies in Genesis 5 list long lifespans before the flood. The genealogies in Genesis 11 list shorter lifespans after the flood. This is not coincidence. This is cultural memory preserved across civilizations. The tablets describe the earliest cities in human history: Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Shuruppak. These cities appear in the Sumerian King List, the Eridu Genesis, and other ancient texts. They are also located in the region where Genesis places the rivers of Eden. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through this land. The ancient riverbeds of the Pishon and Gihon have been identified by modern researchers. The world of Genesis is the world of Sumer. Eridu is particularly significant. It is considered the oldest city in the world. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of temples built on top of each other, going back to the earliest days of civilization. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Genesis describes the earliest human world in the same region. This is not coincidence. This is geography confirming the biblical narrative. To understand the tablets, we need to understand how ancient people viewed the world. The Sumerians believed the universe was a three-tiered structure: the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the underworld below. They believed the gods lived in the heavens, humans lived on earth, and the dead went to the underworld. This cosmology is reflected in their art, their literature, and their architecture. Genesis uses similar language, but with a crucial difference. The Sumerians believed in many gods. Genesis declares that there is one God. The Sumerians believed the gods were flawed, petty, and unpredictable. Genesis describes God as sovereign, righteous, and just. The Sumerians believed the gods created humans to be their servants. Genesis says God created humans in his image. The Sumerians believed the gods sent the flood because humans were too noisy. Genesis says God sent the flood because humanity had become corrupt and violent. These differences are not trivial. They reveal the theological superiority of Genesis. Genesis is not borrowing from Sumerian mythology, it is correcting it. The language of the tablets is also revealing. The Sumerian language is unlike any other. It is not related to Hebrew, Akkadian, or any other known language. It is a linguistic isolate, but the ideas expressed in the tablets are familiar: creation, flood, kingship, divine judgment. These ideas appear in Genesis, but in a purified form. The Hebrew language of Genesis is precise. It uses specific terms to describe creation, humanity, and the flood. The word for create, bara, is used only for divine activity. The word for deep, tahom, echoes the Mesopotamian Tiamat, but without the mythology. The word for ark, tiba, appears only in two places: the story of Noah and the story of Moses' basket. Both are vessels of salvation. These linguistic details show that Genesis is not a myth. It is a carefully crafted theological narrative rooted in real history. The genealogies in Genesis are often overlooked, but they are crucial to understanding the connection between Genesis and the tablets. The genealogies list the ages of the patriarchs, their sons, and their descendants. These ages are not random, they follow a pattern. The pre-flood patriarchs live long lives. The post-flood patriarchs live shorter lives. This pattern matches the Sumerian King List. The King List exaggerates the ages of the pre-flood kings, but the structure is the same. Long lives before the flood, shorter lives after the flood. This is not coincidence. This is cultural memory preserved across civilizations. The genealogies in Genesis do more than list names and ages. They form a bridge between the ancient world and the world after the flood. They show continuity. They show memory. They show that the biblical authors were not inventing stories. They were preserving history. And when we compare these genealogies to the Sumerian King List, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Both traditions remember a world before the flood where humans lived long lives. Both remember a catastrophic flood that reset human history. Both remember a new world emerging afterward. These are not random similarities. They are the fingerprints of a shared past. The Sumerians appear suddenly in history. They did not evolve slowly from earlier cultures. They arrived fully formed with writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and monumental architecture. Scholars have long puzzled over this. How did the first civilization emerge so quickly? Where did their knowledge come from? The Sumerians themselves said their knowledge came from the gods. But Genesis offers a different explanation. Humanity before the flood was not primitive, it was advanced, it had knowledge, it had culture, it had technology. The flood did not erase human intelligence, it scattered it. When the survivors of the flood spread out across the world, they carried fragments of their knowledge with them. Some settled in Mesopotamia and built the first cities. Others migrated to different regions. But the memory of the flood, the memory of creation, and the memory of the earliest generations remained. This explains why the Sumerians appear suddenly in history. They were not inventing civilization, they were rebuilding it. The Sumerian King List emphasizes that kingship descended from heaven. This idea is central to their worldview. They believed that the authority to rule came from the divine realm. Genesis presents a similar idea but in a different form. It describes humanity as created in the image of God, given dominion over the earth. This is not kingship in the political sense, but it is kingship in the theological sense. Humanity was created to rule, to steward, to govern. The Sumerians preserved this idea, but in a distorted form. They believed kings were semi-divine. Genesis says humans are made in the image of God, but they are not gods. Again, Genesis corrects the mythology. Flood stories appear in cultures around the world. Native American tribes, African tribes, Asian cultures, Pacific Islanders, and ancient European societies all preserve flood traditions. Many describe a righteous man, a divine warning, a boat, animals, and a global catastrophe. These stories are not identical, but they share a common core. This is exactly what we would expect if a real event occurred in humanity's early history. Anthropologists have documented over 200 flood traditions across continents. Some are detailed, some are symbolic. But the fact that so many cultures remember a flood is significant. It suggests that the flood was not a local event. It was a global memory. And the Sumerian tablets are the earliest written record of that memory. Genesis is not simply a historical record. It is a theological masterpiece. It presents God as the creator, the judge, and the redeemer. It presents humanity as created in God's image, fallen into sin, and in need of salvation. It presents the flood as both judgment and mercy. It presents the covenant with Noah as a promise of stability and hope. The Sumerian tablets preserve fragments of this story, but they lack the theological depth. They describe the gods as capricious, petty, and unpredictable. They describe humanity as an annoyance. They describe the flood as a reaction to noise. Genesis presents a different picture. It presents God as righteous, just, and compassionate. It presents the flood as a response to corruption and violence. It presents humanity as valuable, even in judgment. These differences reveal the superiority of the biblical account. The names in the genealogies of Genesis and the names in the Sumerian King List share linguistic patterns. Some scholars have noted similarities between names like Adam and Adamu, Seth and Sutu, Enosh and Enshi. These parallels are debated, but they are intriguing. They suggest that the earliest names in human history may have been preserved across cultures. Names carry memory. Names carry identity. Names carry history. The fact that similar names appear in both traditions is another clue that they share a common origin. Memory was sacred in the ancient world. Stories were not entertainment. They were identity. They were heritage. They were the way a culture preserved its past. The flood story, the creation story, and the genealogies were not myths to the ancient people. They were the explanation for why the world was the way it was. They were the foundation of their worldview. And when writing emerged, These stories were the first to be recorded. This explains why the earliest written texts in human history are not about politics or economics. They are about creation, divine beings, and a catastrophic flood. These were the stories that mattered most. These were the stories that defined humanity, and these were the stories that Genesis preserves in their purest form. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Sumerian tablets is what they do not say. They do not describe evolution. They do not describe a slow development of civilization. They do not describe a gradual rise of culture. They describe sudden beginnings. They describe divine intervention. They describe catastrophic judgment. They describe a world that matches the broad outline of Genesis. This silence is powerful. It suggests that the earliest civilizations did not see themselves as the product of slow development. They saw themselves as the descendants of survivors. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a world that had been destroyed and rebuilt. This is exactly what Genesis describes. Eridu is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, yet few people know about it. It is considered the oldest city in human history. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of temples built on top of each other, going back to the earliest days of civilization. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Genesis describes the earliest human world in the same region. This is not coincidence. This is geography confirming the biblical narrative. Eridu also plays a role in the flood story. Some scholars believe that the earliest flood traditions originated in this region. The geography of southern Mesopotamia makes it vulnerable to massive flooding. The rivers can overflow, the sea can rise, the land is flat. A catastrophic flood could easily cover the entire region. This is exactly what the tablets describe. Shuruppak is another key site. It is the city named in the flood tablets as the home of the flood hero. Archaeologists have found a massive flood layer at Shuruppak, dating to around 2900 BC. This layer is thick, widespread, and unmistakable. It sits directly above the remains of the early city and directly below the remains of the rebuilt city. Something catastrophic happened, something that matches the flood described in the tablets. The fact that the flood layer at Shuruppak aligns with the timeline of the Sumerian King List is significant. It suggests that the King List is not myth. It is history. It preserves the memory of a real event, and that event matches the flood described in Genesis. Genesis describes 4 rivers flowing out of Eden: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates are well known. The Pishon and Gihon have been debated, but modern researchers have identified ancient riverbeds in the Arabian Peninsula and northeastern Africa that match the descriptions. These rivers once flowed through regions that were lush and fertile. The world of Genesis is not mythological. It is geographical. It is real. The Sumerian tablets also describe rivers, canals, and irrigation systems. They describe a world shaped by water. They describe a world vulnerable to flooding. They describe a world that matches the geography of Genesis. This is not coincidence. This is evidence. The Sumerian tablets describe a pantheon of gods. These gods are powerful, but they are flawed. They argue, they fight, they make mistakes. They act out of anger, jealousy, and fear. They are not worthy of worship. They are not worthy of trust. They are reflections of human weakness. Genesis presents a different picture. It presents God as sovereign, righteous, and just. It presents God as the creator, not a creature. It presents God as the judge, not a participant in chaos. It presents God as the redeemer, not a destroyer. The contrast is stark. The Sumerian gods are mythological distortions. The God of Genesis is the original. When we step back and look at the big picture, a pattern emerges. The Sumerian tablets preserve fragments of humanity's earliest memories. They preserve the memory of creation. They preserve the memory of the flood. They preserve the memory of the earliest generations. But they preserve these memories in a distorted form. Genesis preserves the same memories, but in a purified form. This is not the behavior of a copy. This is the behavior of an original. The tablets confirm the broad outline of Genesis. They confirm that humanity remembered its origins. They confirm that the flood was a real event. They confirm that the earliest civilizations preserved these memories. They confirm that Genesis is not myth, it is memory. The deeper we go into the Sumerian tablets, the more the mystery grows. Instead of undermining the Bible, these ancient texts strengthen it. Instead of contradicting Genesis, they confirm it. Instead of disproving the flood, they support it. Instead of challenging the biblical narrative, they illuminate it. The Sumerian tablets are not the enemy of Genesis, they are its witnesses. They testify that the earliest civilizations remembered the same events Genesis records. They testify that the flood was real. They testify that humanity's origins were known long before writing existed. They testify that Genesis is not a late invention. It is the original story. And when we compare the tablets to Genesis, one truth becomes clear. The Bible is not borrowing from Sumer. Sumer is remembering what the Bible records. The tablets prove that Genesis is rooted in real history. They prove that the earliest civilizations preserved the memory of creation and the flood. They prove that the Bible stands on solid ground. And they prove that the story of humanity's beginnings is older, deeper, and more interconnected than most people realize.